An unknown number called me every day at the exact same time after I slept with my high school ex. I finally answered thinking it was spam, but it was a girl crying and asking me if I knew she was still living with him, and that was the moment I realized the man who swore to me they had already broken up had never actually told her the relationship was over. I'm not the kind of person who overthinks things. When something ends, it ends, period. I told myself that many times during the years when Daniel Rivera didn't exist in my life as anything more than a name that occasionally came up in conversations about high school, those conversations you have when you reconnect with someone from the past and start going over who ended up where. Do you remember Daniel? Yeah, I remembered him. Then the conversation would move on to something else, and so would I, without it costing me anything. That's why I didn't fully understand what happened to me the night I saw his name light up my phone screen. It was a Wednesday. An ordinary October Wednesday, the kind that doesn't have anything special about it except that it starts getting dark earlier and you still haven't gotten used to it yet. I was sitting in my apartment living room with a plate of chicken and rice balanced on my legs, the TV on with something I wasn't really watching, and my phone face down on the cushion beside me. I had it face down because I'd spent the entire afternoon waiting for a response from a job application I'd sent 2 weeks earlier, and I'd already realized that checking my phone every 5 minutes didn't make anything happen faster, it just made me more anxious. Then it vibrated once, that short buzz pattern for a text message, and I flipped it over without much enthusiasm, thinking it was Laura asking if I wanted to go out that weekend, or my mom sending some random picture without context like she always does. It was Daniel Rivera. I still had him saved with his last name. That's something I do with certain people without really thinking about it, like an unconscious way of keeping a distance that the contact itself doesn't establish. The people who are part of my everyday life are saved with just a first name. The ones in another category get a last name too. Daniel Rivera. For years without hearing a thing from each other, and there was his full name on my screen at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday night. The message said, "Hey, how have you been?" I stared at it a little longer than necessary. I thought about not replying. That was my first instinct, that the simplest thing would be not to answer, to leave him on read or not even open it, keep eating my rice and let those 3 words float there unanswered until both of us silently understood that was probably for the best. Then I thought about replying with something short and cold, something that said what needed to be said without requiring me to explain anything. "I'm good, thanks," with a period at the end, because in text messages the period says everything the words don't. But I didn't do either of those things. I asked how he got my new number. He said my cousin Valeria had given it to him at a family gathering I hadn't gone to because I'd been out of town with a friend that weekend. I told him I was going to talk to Valeria. He said not to blame her, that he'd been the one insisting pretty hard for it, and for some reason, that felt more honest than if he'd claimed she'd offered it on her own. At least he admitted he'd made the effort to get it. We texted for a while that first night. It wasn't a deep or life-changing conversation. It was the kind of conversation two people have when they knew each other during a different phase of their lives and are quietly testing the ground without wanting to admit they're doing it. "How's your family? What have you been up to?" "Yeah, I changed jobs a while ago too. I moved to another state 2 years ago." "That's great." That kind of exchange that would feel empty with someone else but works with certain people because underneath the ordinary questions there's another conversation both people are having in silence. What I did notice, even though I didn't analyze it too much at the time, was that he texted differently than I remembered. High school Daniel had been intense in the kind of way that feels romantic at 16 and exhausting by 20. Always present, always emotionally dependent, the kind of person who needed to know exactly how you felt at all times and interpreted silence as a sign that something was wrong. This version of him was calmer, more willing to let silence exist peacefully. I don't know if that made him more attractive or simply more unfamiliar, but the combination of both kept me talking to him much longer than I'd planned. We kept texting for 3 weeks, almost every day. Sometimes long conversations, sometimes just 1 or 2 messages before bed. I didn't tell anyone, not because I had anything to hide, but because I knew exactly what people were going to say and I didn't have the energy to defend myself against opinions about something that hadn't even happened yet. Laura has a very well-developed theory about high school exes that sounds reasonable the first time you hear it and somehow keeps sounding reasonable every time after that too. Her theory is that when a high school ex suddenly reappears in your adult life, it's usually because something in their current life isn't working and they've confused nostalgia for something deeper. I'd agreed with her many times when it was someone else's life. This time I chose not to test the theory. Toward the end of October, Daniel told me he was going to be in my city the last weekend of the month. A work trip, he explained, but staying a couple of extra days wouldn't be difficult. He asked if I wanted to meet for coffee. I replied yes almost before I finished reading the question. Then I set my phone down on the table and stared at the ceiling for a minute. We met Saturday afternoon at a cafe I had specifically chosen because it wasn't a place I normally went to. I wanted neutral ground, somewhere without history attached to it, no waiters who knew my name, no corners that reminded me of other things. I arrived 5 minutes late on purpose. That's something I do when I'm nervous and don't want it to show. If you arrive after the other person, you get a few seconds to read the situation before the situation reads you. He was sitting at a table in the back. He stood up when he saw me walk in, and that simple gesture, standing up, was enough for something in my chest to shift in a way I hadn't expected and immediately decided to ignore until further notice. We stayed there for 4 hours. That's what threw me off. How easy it was. The ease of that afternoon was the most unexpected thing of all, because I'd shown up prepared for it to feel awkward or strange or filled with those silences that happen when two people share history but no longer really know each other. But it wasn't any of those things. It was easy in the way very few things are once you're an adult and you've spent years building protective layers around the things that matter to you. We actually talked about how we'd both changed, about mistakes we'd made at different points in our lives. He talked about a rough period when he was 22, after losing a job he deeply cared about and spending almost a year feeling directionless. I talked about a relationship that had ended 3 years earlier in a way I still struggle to describe, not because it had been devastating but because it had been gradual, the kind of ending that doesn't happen in a single moment but instead one day you just realize it's already over even though nobody ever said it out loud. He mentioned he'd dated someone for a while, but that it had ended more than a year earlier. He said it casually, without emphasis, like background information. I didn't ask further. I didn't feel like I needed to. By the time we left, it was already dark outside, and the street beyond the cafe had that specific sound Saturday evenings get when the afternoon is slowly turning into night. He walked me to my car, which was parked half a block away. We stood on the sidewalk for a moment without either of us seeming in a hurry to leave. He told me it had been the best afternoon he'd had in a long time. He said it directly, without decoration, in the way someone speaks when they're no longer trying to impress anyone. And I believed him. When I got back to my apartment that night and dropped my keys onto the entryway table, I went straight to the couch in my living room. The same couch where I'd received his message weeks earlier. I sat down and realized I was smiling alone in an empty room, and somehow that felt both a little ridiculous and completely honest. What happened after that unfolded slowly and then all at once, which is how almost everything important happens. We saw each other again Sunday too. We walked through a park he vaguely remembered from when we were kids, though it turned out to be much smaller than either of us remembered, the way childhood places always are. We walked for 2 hours without any real destination, stopping whenever we wanted, talking about unimportant things and deeply important things all tangled together without order, which is how conversations work when two people are being honest without trying too hard to be. Monday night, before he caught his flight home, I stayed at his hotel. It wasn't a decision I made after a great deal of deliberation. It was a decision that felt natural in a way nothing had felt in a very long time, and sometimes that's enough. Sometimes the naturalness of something is its own reason. The next morning I said goodbye to him in the hotel lobby at 6 in the morning. It was still dark outside. He needed to get to the airport early, and neither of us had slept much. He kissed my forehead before stepping into the elevator, a gesture I hadn't expected and that stayed with me much longer than I would have predicted. I walked outside and the October air was cold and everything felt very still, the way cities do before they've fully woken up and the sidewalk almost feels like it belongs only to you. I drove back to my apartment with the heat blasting and the radio playing something I don't even remember. I got home, showered, ate breakfast, went to work. Everything normal. Everything exactly where it belonged. 2 days later, the call started. The first day I ignored it without thinking much about it. It was a number I didn't have saved, no name attached, with an area code from a state that wasn't mine or Daniel's. It was Tuesday morning and I was at my desk trying to focus on a report I had to turn in before noon. My phone buzzed, I saw unknown number, and let it ring out. I have that habit with numbers I don't recognize, especially during work hours. If it's important, they leave a voicemail. If they don't leave one, then it probably wasn't that important. They didn't leave a voicemail. I forgot about it before I even finished the paragraph I was working on. The second day it called again. Exactly at 8:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because that morning I was eating breakfast and had set my phone face up on the table when it started ringing. I saw the time on the screen next to the number and thought it was strange, but not strange enough to actually do anything about it. I still didn't answer. Still no voicemail. The third day, same thing. 8:47, the same number. By the third day I started noticing the pattern, but I explained it away in ways that felt reasonable to me. Maybe it was some automated company system that had my number in their database. Maybe it was a medical or dental appointment reminder someone had accidentally scheduled under my number. Automated calls sometimes work like that, fixed times, repeated attempts for several days before finally giving up. By the fourth day I confirmed it was always at the same time, and I started feeling something that wasn't exactly curiosity but more that mild discomfort you get from something you don't understand. I still didn't answer. Still no voicemail. The fifth day I mentioned it casually during lunch with a coworker. I told her some number kept calling me every day at the exact same time without leaving a message. She said it was probably sophisticated spam, that there were apps that did that to make sure you were available before transferring you to a real operator. It sounded plausible. She told me to block the number. I thought about doing it, but I didn't, and I couldn't really explain to myself why I hadn't. On the sixth day, instead of blocking it, I saved it in my contacts as weird number. I had no logical reason to save it instead of blocking it. It was just a small, inexplicable impulse, like when you decide to keep something you're not sure you'll need but aren't ready to throw away either. The seventh day was Tuesday. I was eating breakfast in my kitchen, coffee with milk and a piece of toast, morning light leaking through the window from outside. At 8:46 I picked up my phone and placed it on the table in front of me. I stared at it. At exactly 8:47, it rang. Weird number. I watched it ring for 4 or 5 seconds. Then I thought, if it's spam, I'll confirm it in 10 seconds and block it. If it's someone with the wrong number, I'll tell them they've got the wrong person and that'll be the end of it. If it's something else, I'll know once I answer. Not answering hasn't given me any answers in 7 days. I swiped to answer. The first second was silence. Not the silence of a recording that hasn't started yet or bad reception. It was the very specific silence of a real person on the other end of the line who hadn't actually expected me to answer. Someone who had spent days calling, and suddenly, on the 7th attempt, the line had finally opened for real and they didn't know what to do with that. Then I heard breathing. Controlled, but not completely. The kind of breathing someone has when they're trying to hold themselves together over something that hasn't fully come apart yet. Then I heard my name. Not as a question. Not "is this you?" but as confirmation, as if she already knew it was me and simply needed to say my name out loud before she could begin. That distinction felt important, even though at the time I wouldn't have been able to explain why. I told her yes, it was me, and asked who I was speaking to. There was a brief pause. When she spoke again, I noticed the texture of her voice. There's a very specific way someone sounds when they've been crying hard and only stopped a little while ago. Slightly rough around the edges, with a fragility that isn't weakness so much as exhaustion. Like speaking itself takes more effort than usual. She told me her name was Sarah. She said she had a question, and that she needed me to tell her the truth. That I needed to promise her I would tell the truth before she asked, because if I said I didn't know anything when I actually did, she needed to know that too, and that was why she was asking for the promise first. I didn't promise her anything. I couldn't promise something before I even knew what this was about. I told her it depended on the question, that if I knew something I would tell her, but first I needed to know what she was talking about. There was another pause. Longer this time. I was sitting completely still in my kitchen chair with the phone pressed against my ear, my untouched toast sitting in front of me, my coffee still steaming into the air. I waited. Sarah asked me if I knew she was still living with him. I didn't understand immediately. I asked who she was talking about. She said Daniel's name. The coffee went cold. The toast stayed where it was. And I didn't move for the next 30 seconds, which is a very long time not to move. I didn't hang up. That's the first thing I want to make clear, because during the days that followed I asked myself many times what would have happened if I had. If I'd said she had the wrong number, or told her I had no idea what she was talking about, and ended the conversation before it had truly begun. I asked myself that without ever arriving at a clear answer. What I do know is that I didn't hang up, and the reason I didn't was something instinctive, something that existed before my brain had enough time to fully process what was happening. I told her to explain. Sarah explained. And I listened without interrupting, sitting in that kitchen chair with my back straight and my free hand flat against the table, like I needed something solid beneath my palm to keep myself steady while I listened. She and Daniel had been together for 2 years and 8 months. They'd met at work, at a company where they both ended up working on the same temporary project, and what started as occasionally getting dinner together slowly became something serious without either of them really planning for it to happen that way. A year and a half earlier, they'd moved in together. Both their names were on the lease. They shared expenses for the apartment. They had routines, shared things, the kind of life that takes time to build and that looks solid from the outside because in many ways it is. About 6 weeks earlier, she said, he had started acting differently. Not in a dramatic or obvious way, but in that subtle way that's much harder to point to because each individual thing has a reasonable explanation. More distracted during dinner. Shorter replies to messages. Keeping his phone face down all the time when he never used to. Coming home a little later than usual without any particularly convincing reason for it. She had confronted him once, around 2 weeks after noticing the change, and he told her he was under a lot of stress at work, that there was a complicated project taking more out of him than he'd expected. She believed him. Not because she was naive, but because she had no concrete reason not to. Work stress was real and verifiable. The explanation made sense. Until she found my name in his phone. She didn't find the messages, she told me. He had deleted them or hidden the entire conversation somewhere she never found. What she did find was my name and his recent calls several times, and somewhere in his contacts. She asked him who I was. He told her I was an old high school friend he'd randomly reconnected with, that we'd gotten coffee while he was visiting my city, that we dated years ago but that it was ancient history and nothing to worry about. What he didn't tell her was that something more than coffee had happened between us. What he also didn't tell her, and this was the part I had the hardest time processing when Sarah explained it, was that he and she had supposedly broken up. Because they hadn't. They were still living together. Still sharing the same bed. He was still her boyfriend in every visible way, in every way anyone looking from the outside would have understood. There had been no breakup conversation. No agreement. He had simply decided, at some point, to behave as though reality looked one way while the truth was something entirely different. Sarah got my number through a chain of events she explained to me, but that was indirect enough for me to lose track of some of the details. I understood that somehow she'd ended up connected to Valeria, that Valeria hadn't directly handed over my number but had left it accessible somewhere and Sarah had taken it from there. I didn't ask for more specifics because those weren't the details that mattered anymore. What she said next did matter. She told me she'd been calling me for a week. That the first day she dialed, she hung up before it even rang. That the second day she let it ring but hung up before I could answer, or before it reached voicemail. That she had built up the courage little by little, call by call, until that 7th day when she finally stayed on the line long enough for me to pick up. I asked why she always called at the exact same time. She told me it was the time Daniel went out running every morning. 45 minutes. Always. It was the only moment she knew for certain he wouldn't be in the apartment, and if I answered and said something she didn't want him overhearing, at least that risk was controlled. That told me something about the level of care with which she had planned every one of those 7 days. It wasn't impulsive. It was methodical. It was someone who desperately needed to know something and had found the only safe window in which to try to find out. When she finished talking, there was silence. I let it sit there for a moment before speaking. Then she asked me if it was true, if I knew she existed and that they were still together. I told her no. I told her he had mentioned dating someone before, but had described it as something that had ended more than a year earlier. I told her there had been no signs, nothing concrete, that made me think he was lying, because there hadn't been. I told her all of that in a calm voice while internally I was processing several things at once in a way that wasn't exactly orderly. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't only anger. It felt more like being in a room you thought you knew well and suddenly someone turns on a light that had always been off, and you realize the room has walls in places where you thought there had been open space. She believed me. Or at least that's what it felt like. Her response didn't sound like someone doubting what I was saying. It sounded like someone hearing confirmation of something she had already suspected but needed another person to say out loud before she could treat it as real. She said, "Thank you for answering." That sentence stayed with me. Not because of the words themselves, but because of the way she said them, with a tone that made it obvious she'd been carrying them around for days, that she had imagined that exact thank you during the entire week it took her to finally reach me. I asked her if she was okay. She said no, but that she would be. I don't know if that's the most honest answer anyone has ever given me to that question or if it only feels that way because it came from someone who no longer had the energy to build anything more elaborate. Probably both. We hung up. I stayed sitting in the kitchen for a length of time I never measured. Outside, morning continued being morning. The upstairs neighbor made the same familiar noise moving around their apartment. A car drove past outside. Everything exactly the same as before, which is one of the most disorienting things in existence. The world outside doesn't register the moments that quietly rearrange everything inside you. Then I opened my conversation with Daniel. It was all there, perfectly normal, the history of weeks of messages that suddenly looked like they'd been written by two people I no longer fully recognized. I saw the last message he'd sent me 2 days earlier, something about a TV series. I saw the heart reaction I'd left on it. I closed the app, opened my call history instead, found his number, and called him. He answered on the third ring. His voice was completely normal. That casual tone, lightly pleasantly surprised, the tone of someone getting an unexpected call from a person they like. Hey, what a surprise. You usually text me. With a small laugh at the end, the kind that communicates the situation is pleasant and that he's open for whatever I wanted. That upset me more than anything else, that tone of normality. The fact that his voice registered nothing, that he could be on the other side of the phone sounding exactly the same as he did every other day while his girlfriend was somewhere inside the apartment they shared and I had just spent 30 minutes listening to everything he had built in parallel. I said, I just spoke to Sarah. Silence. It was a different kind of silence from any other silence we'd had before. Not the silence of someone thinking about how to respond. The silence of someone who has just understood exactly what the sentence they heard means and is now calculating, in real time, how big the problem is and from which angle it would be smartest to approach it. I didn't say anything else. I let the silence sit there. When he finally started speaking, the first thing he said was my name. Not as an answer, but as an attempt to reorganize the space, as if saying my name out loud could somehow force the conversation back into the version he would have preferred it to be. Then he said he could explain. I told him I wasn't interested in the explanation yet. What I was interested in was whether it was true, whether he was still living with her, whether she had no idea they had supposedly broken up, whether what he told me that afternoon at the cafe, that the relationship had ended more than a year earlier, had been a lie from beginning to end or some distorted version of something he had convinced himself to believe. He didn't say no. What he said was that the situation was complicated, that he and Sarah had been unhappy for a long time, that for months he had felt the relationship no longer worked, but he hadn't found the right moment to have that conversation because those conversations are difficult and easy to postpone, that when he reconnected with me and what happened between us happened, what he felt was real, something he hadn't felt in a long time, and that he didn't want to lose it over something he already considered over where it mattered, even if it hadn't officially been said out loud yet. He used the word emotionally. He said they had already broken up emotionally. I let him finish speaking without interrupting. Then I said, the situation isn't complicated. You lied. That's simple. He said I didn't understand what it's like to be with someone for that long and want to end things without hurting them. I told him he was probably right, that I had never been in that situation and couldn't know exactly what it feels like. But what I did know was that Sarah had spent 7 days calling my number at 8:47 every morning because it was the only moment she could be certain he wasn't inside the apartment. That wasn't abstract. That was a real person building a 15-minute strategy every morning just to ask a question she never should have had to ask in the first place. That this wasn't a complicated situation. It was the direct result of him choosing to lie to her about what was happening and lie to me about what his life actually looked like. He started trying to say something else. I didn't let him finish. I told him not to call me, not to text me, that I was going to block him immediately and whatever he did with his life after that was no longer my concern. Then I hung up. I blocked him instantly, before he could call back or send a message. I didn't want to give myself time to reconsider. When you block someone immediately after saying exactly what needed to be said, there's a small satisfaction in the speed of it, in not leaving any window open. Then I opened my contacts, searched for weird number, and changed the name to Sarah. I saved it that way. Not because I had some plan to speak to her again, but because deleting the number after everything that morning had meant felt like a small betrayal I didn't want to commit. Keeping the number was the simplest way to acknowledge that this person had existed in my morning and that it mattered, even if I had no idea what I was supposed to do with that. I stood up, threw away the toast still sitting on the plate, washed the coffee mug, grabbed my bag and went to work. People who haven't been through something like that sometimes think the worst part is the revelation itself, the instant you find out. And yes, that moment is brutal. But the hardest part isn't the moment itself. It's all the moments afterward, when you're doing ordinary things, washing a plate or waiting for the traffic light to change or putting in your headphones on the subway, and your brain starts replaying conversations through entirely new eyes. Every single thing he said. Every single thing you said without knowing what he already knew. The afternoon at the cafe. The part Tuesday morning in the hotel lobby with the cold air outside. All of it revisited from a different angle, with new information, and the very specific feeling of having participated in something without ever being handed the full script. That's what arrived that night when I was alone again in my apartment. And the nights after that. But that part comes later. 3 weeks later, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. I read it thinking it was some kind of advertisement, one of those automated marketing texts companies send even though you never sign up for them. It said, "This is Sarah. I know you don't owe me anything and that this might be weird, but there's something I wanted to tell you, if that's okay." I read it twice. Then I replied, "Go ahead." She took a few minutes to answer. I was home, a Sunday afternoon, with nothing urgent to do. I waited. She told me that the afternoon I called Daniel was the same afternoon he came home acting different. She described it as him carrying something on him, a tension she couldn't quite interpret but immediately recognized as different from the work stress he'd claimed to be dealing with. She confronted him before dinner, before he had time to prepare any version of events. He talked. Not completely honestly, according to Sarah, but in the way someone talks when they know they can no longer keep pretending nothing is happening, while still trying to control how much they admit and in what order. The conversation lasted hours. Sarah told me there were moments when she yelled and moments when she couldn't speak at all. That at one point he cried, which unsettled her because she had barely ever seen him cry before. That they both said things neither of them was probably fully proud of. And that by the end of the night, close to midnight, he packed a bag with the essentials and left to stay at a friend's place. She didn't tell me every detail of that conversation. She told me the outline of it. I imagine the details belong to her, to that private space that forms between two people when a relationship falls apart, and that space doesn't necessarily belong to someone who entered the story through a side door halfway through. What she did tell me was that the first week afterward had been very hard, that there were days she had no appetite and only ate because she knew she was supposed to, that the apartment felt different without him there even though it had never been a place she particularly loved, that sometimes she'd find herself staring at things of his that were still around, a jacket hanging near the entrance, a book on the nightstand, and have to decide whether to put them away or leave them there until he came to pick them up. But then she told me something I hadn't expected. She said that what I confirmed to her that Tuesday morning, at 8:47, had given her something she hadn't realized she needed: certainty. Not about me specifically, but about the entire situation. That when you spend a long time in a relationship where something feels wrong but you can't quite identify exactly what is wrong, your mind starts turning against you. It starts generating possibilities, dismissing them, generating new ones again, until eventually you don't know whether what you're sensing is real or whether you're the one inventing a problem that doesn't exist. And that ambiguity, that constant fog of uncertainty, is in many ways more exhausting than simply knowing something painful for sure. What I confirmed for her that morning, she said, cleared the fog. And even though what came afterward was painful, at least it was real. At least it had shape. At least she knew where she was standing. She thanked me for answering. Specifically for that. For not telling her she had the wrong number. For not hanging up. For not giving her an answer that would have left her exactly where she already was. She said she didn't know whether I could have done those things, but she was grateful I hadn't. For a moment, I genuinely didn't know how to respond. I sat there staring at my phone screen in the quiet Sunday light, trying to figure out what you even say in a situation like that. There's no protocol for it. No prepared response anyone teaches you for the moment a woman you've never met thanks you for being honest about a situation neither of you should have ever been trapped inside. I finally texted back that I was sorry. That I wished neither of us had ever had to go through any of it. That I was glad she knew the truth now, even if the truth had arrived by a road she never deserved to travel. She took a minute to respond. When she did, she said, "Me too." And then, after another pause, she added something I kept thinking about long after the conversation ended. "I wonder what would have happened if you never answered." I told her I'd wondered the same thing. The honest answer is that I don't know. I don't know what Daniel would have done with a situation he clearly didn't know how to resolve. I don't know whether he eventually would have taken control of it himself or whether he would have kept postponing things until circumstances solved them for him, which is what a lot of people do when they don't want to face something directly. I don't know how much longer that fog would have lasted for Sarah. I don't know what would have happened with whatever Daniel and I had, if it even would have remained something at all, which it absolutely wasn't anymore, but in some parallel version of events where I never answered, maybe it would have continued as something built on a lie I didn't know was a lie. Some things can never really be known because they depend entirely on a decision you already made one way instead of another. What I do know is that Sarah called for 7 straight days at 8:47 in the morning, calculating Daniel's 45-minute run with the kind of precision that tells you exactly how badly she needed to make that call and how much courage it took to finally do it. And that on the 7th day, I answered almost automatically, without a script, without any idea what was waiting for me, with toast on the table and coffee still hot beside me. We never texted again after that Sunday. There was no need to, and I think we both understood that. Some people enter your life through a very specific door, do what they came there to do, and leave through the same door. Trying to force something beyond that would only distort what it originally was, turning it into something else just to satisfy a need for continuity that isn't always real. I never contacted Daniel again. I wasn't curious about how things turned out for him afterward. That surprised me about myself for a while, because at first I was curious, that uncomfortable kind of curiosity someone can leave behind when they matter to you even after you've decided they no longer should. But eventually it faded. And when it faded, I realized there wasn't much left to resolve. Weeks later, I told Laura everything. I sat across from her in her kitchen with 2 cups of tea between us and started from the beginning: Daniel's message, the 3 weeks of conversations, the weekend together, the unknown number calling every day at the exact same time, Sarah, the phone call, calling Daniel afterward, blocking him, and the text from Sarah 3 weeks later. Laura listened without interrupting me, which is unusual for her because she's one of those people who thinks while speaking and has to say her thoughts in the moment or she loses them. The fact that she stayed silent this time told me she was genuinely processing something. When I finished, she picked up her tea, took a sip, and said, "You know what stands out to me the most about all this?" I asked what. That you answered. She was right. That is, in a way, the strangest part. I'm not someone who answers unknown numbers. I've had that rule for years, more out of habit than any specific reason, and I follow it almost automatically. But something made me not block that number for 6 days. And then, on the 7th day, answer it. I don't have an explanation that sounds meaningful. There was no inner voice. No sign from the universe. It was simply what happened that morning, with breakfast on the table and the number glowing on my screen. I swiped to answer. But sometimes I think Sarah knew it too, in a way that wasn't entirely rational. That she kept calling for 7 days because somewhere underneath the fear and uncertainty there was something telling her that eventually I would answer. That it was worth trying one more morning. And it turned out she was right. And in the end, that was enough for both of us.